Summer 924, sent. Osrith remembered a time, in Alba, when young Finan had told her a story. It was from a long time ago, in a land far, far away. It told a story of a man, a commander, who had fought beside his lord and king for 10 years, until finally, by subterfuge and deception, the land was won. The war had started over a woman kidnapped by her lover who lived in that country that was to be besieged. But that wasn't the story. No, Osrith had asked, as they had walked across the courtyard. Edra had joined them and they had sat on the wall beside the chapel. Because, no one really asks what happens in the days following a battle, he had confided. Where is that written? Osrith had asked. But young Finan had shaken his head. I didn't read it anywhere, he told her. Is it not true? It is true, Osrith told him. And then young Finan slipped into the mantle of Selicht, and began the story. It took 10 years for the man to get back home again. He left from the war, and took a ship home, but a series of disasters befell him. Did he get over the disasters? Edra had asked. Yes, he nodded. And even when he was home, it was not over, for his wife was being courted, for it was assumed that he was dead. He even had to con his way into his own palace to be reunited with his wife. But these thoughts were in the future. Osrith had brought them to mind when the regrets of leaving her own lands were pressing in the days to come. She should never have gone to Bibbenberg, that accursed place. Nor should Utad. Only, what he had done for his nephew had been bold. Reckless, but bold. Idiotic but brave. And had Ethelhelm's men raided Berwick, or Bibbenberg for that matter, they would have asked no questions and young Finan would be dead. Now, she was following a trail. By rights, Aldhelm should have had her executed for deserting her place, and she had deserted it, technically. But she was also working for Mercia, and she had known something was wrong. That was in the future. Now, a half-drowned woman was pulling herself up onto the jagged rocks that lined a good deal of the North Sentish coast. It was a fine afternoon, with the sort of warmth made for sitting in the sun, offering the least exertion possible. But Wakilt was not in the sun, nor was the water warm. Yet, Osrith had managed to get to land, a miracle, with the currents. The terror of water was not as acute as it had once been when they had been traveling south, and she had been lulled as Trinity had skimmed over the waves propelled by a favorable current. Now, Osrith hung onto rocks, and closed her eyes in prayer, thanking God that she had survived the swim, and that the settlement before her would be needing persons in service, or at the very least, would be easy to squat in for a night. 88,888,888. And then she woke up, looking at a face that she knew. Her head hurt, and her body felt cold. She shivered. She was still in her wet clothes, but now there was a blanket over her body. Eswi? She blinked, and closed her eyes. A hand went to hers, and a blast of hot air came near her. Get Miral, Eswi demanded, or Elfgar, or any one of the Mersins, for the love of God. No, not a Sentishman. He waved a hand. Go. 88,888,888. Her mouth was dry. That was the first thing that Osrith she remembered, a dryness to her throat. She reached up to scratch it, and coughed. She opened her eyes, then closed them. She's awake. Osrith. A hand went to hers, and another to her head. Her body was hot now and her clothes were not wet. She shuffled up and opened her eyes. Someone she recognized. Not Eswi. Keep this blanket around you, Elfkin told her. You've been unwell. Osrith shivered, and reached up to hold her head. The sun was shining, and she was under a canopy, but a fire was still burning. Talk to me, Elfkin, Osrith asked and coughed, reaching for her throat. There was no mistaking his fair hair and bright blue eyes. He glanced up, and caught Egelfrith's eye, who looked to his brother. Oshir knelt down and gave a skin of water to Elfkin. You became unwell, Elfkin told her, his mouth smiling, but with concern in his face. The Sentish warriors got you out of the water, but you collapsed. And he told her that she had begun to convulse and shake, and had fallen to the ground. Their warriors had tried to warm her, but she had fallen as if she had died. We were about to move, but one of the men had, well, discovered you were a woman, and that was not a secret he could keep, Elfkin told her, with care. He now has 2 black eyes and a broken nose, but Osrith found she could not keep her eyes open. Yet she felt for Buey. I have them, Miriel told her. You must have exhausted yourself, Osrith, swimming with your ironware, and another 3 days on boiled broth and water and bread, and Osrith was on her feet. 88,888,888. Osrith, Elfkin explained on the 4th morning as she had got up at dawn and, blanket around her, had gone to take a piss. Oh my word, Osrith. She turned. Well? She asked. Do you have any spare clothes for your commander? And they say and talked together, and Miriel joined them. She told him and Elfkin what had happened, about the kidnapping and taking of the Trinity, and Iajifu. What do you want? Miriel asked. Really want to go home, eventually. I need to row to the fast lanes, where the merchants are, and pay for passage north. And then she asked what had been happening there, between the 2 princes who were vying for one another's thrones. Better to talk to Aldhelm, his is in a good mood, Miriel told her, exchanging looks with Elfkin. He has just struck a bargain with the Sintish commander, sent will reinforce Mercia and support Athelistan, who offers amnesty for Iajifu. And, not missing a chance to oppose Wessex, Osrith added. She knew that they had been subjugated, as had the Cornish, very early on by Wessex, but could not be stripped of their unique characters. That and the other threat, Elfkin told her, passing her bread and meat and ale. Other threat? A child, Elfkin told her. Another child of Edward's. He shook his head. Not that anyone's seen or heard of this child. I think it is a made-up story to sow confusion. But Osrith shivered, and not from any lasting fever. Young Finan. Somehow she knew that there was a core of truth in what her wretched brother had been saying, not real truth, but the gossip that surrounds truth that is incomplete. You know that I was a friend to King Edward. She told Elfkin, who glanced to Miriel and then back to Osrith. I'll get Aldhelm, Miriel told him. You get Eswi. And Miriel and Eswi joined Osrith in tent, in the army camp 20 miles from Lundin. A rumor has begun that my son's father was the late king, and, she began. She glanced Eswi. And I need to tell this to Aldhelm alone, she added. I will tell you afterwards, she told him. I can guess, Eswi said in a low voice. I guessed the minute I saw you and your brother and his men at Sheppey. You were there? Eswi nodded his head, then left through the tent flap, leaving Osrith and Aldhelm alone. He looked across to her, and sighed. Osrith, I am your friend. Whatever you have to say, you can tell me. And Osrith knew that she could. They had been through so much together. He and Osrith had foiled their own assassination of Ethelfled, and he had ensured that Mercia did not break up into factions. He had done so not too long ago, and genuinely served Mercia for the cause of peace and stability. When she said nothing, however, he prompted, please tell me Edward was not your child's father. He is not my child's father, Osrith told him, or ever likely to have been. Osrith knew what he meant. I first was seduced by Edward when he was the Etheling, when I was 14 years old and he was 13, Osrith told Aldhelm. And this continued for many years, until I left Wessex. In fact, she saw Aldhelm sigh a deep sigh, and rest his head on his hand. Osrith, Aldhelm sighed. Oh my word, Osrith, this could be bad, very bad. What possessed you to bring him here? I did not. She told him, and explained how her brother had brought them, all except for Domhnall, and that now she came to think of it, Uhtred had seemed exceptionally interested in his nephew, inviting him to sit with them, eat with them. She looked at Aldhelm. I am sorry that as a warrior when I chose to hump there was a consequence for me. There were many consequences which I had to deal with. But you must believe me when I say that my son's father is my husband. Not Constantine, not Edward. But Aldhelm only stared, then shook his head. Constantine? Good heavens, Osrith, Aldhelm exclaimed, and at this, she turned away, feeling the shame born of years of survival from a man she so respected. Could she have resisted Edward? She supposed so. But he had been insistent, and near the end of the time they knew one another she might well have argued that it was rape. And Constantine? He was different. They were different. Not sunny and easygoing, but strict and stubborn and insistent. He had taken her virtue before even Osrith had known what was happening, and let him have her when he wished. He was home. She felt like she was at home when Constantine fucked her. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder. I do not judge you, Aldhelm told her, nor have I ever judged you or had the right to. How long has it been said that his father may have been Edward? Osrith asked. I assume you heard? Aldhelm sighed, and looked at Osrith carefully. The Lady Ethelflaed did speak to your brother that you had gone to Winchester to beg for aid, Aldhelm told her, and Osrith nodded. Of course, she thought bitterly. Of course she did. When did you hear, Lord Aldhelm? She insisted. Aldhelm sat beside Osrith. Only very recently, on the occasion that the King of Wessex sailed and discussion of the succession was had. Edward had willed that Elf took Wessex's crown and Aethelstan took lordship of Mercia. And then we heard that there was a hidden heir, and that hidden heir was hidden in Alba. It was then repeated, when the topic of the succession came about, as if it were fact, and has, unfortunately, spread widely, and fast. Osrith laughed, but there was no humor in it. It seems to be a known fact in Alba that he is Constantine's, Osrith said, bitterly. And yet, neither can be true. Aldhelm shook his head. Of course, you are married to one of Usad's men, Aldhelm told her. Perhaps he kept the boy close to protect him. I escaped from him at the mouth of the river, Osrith told Aldhelm, and before that, he had a knife to young Finan's throat. So yes, I can see why it may be thought that my brother is protecting his nephew. What can I do? Aldhelm asked. You are dear to me, Osrith. You are a respected warrior with a poor taste in lovers, he added with a small chuckle. And Osrith returned the chuckle and nodded. Except the last, Lord Aldhelm, she told him. And I expect I was the cause of his. She broke off. Of course that was why Utad was saying all of those things, saying that young Finan was Constantine's bastard, because in doing so, and provoking her, she could be goaded into saying it. And if she confirmed he was Constantine's son, he could not therefore, be Edward's son, and therefore be a claimant for the throne. Does this make sense to you, Lord Aldhelm? Osrith asked him, who smiled at her. It makes sense to me, Aldhelm told her, and it depends on the value you put in your brother. His actions could easily be interpreted differently. And then Aldhelm leaned over and kissed Osrith on the forehead. Although, you have been asked not to return to Mercia by Aethelstan, he reminded her, you will now note you are on the south bank of the Thames, in Sent not in Mercia, and clad in Mercian colours. So, he got to his feet. Are you seeking to join us? No, Osrith said, I am seeking to lead you. 88,888,888. They rode into city from the south, coming up to meet the river at a narrower part and crossing the ancient pack horse bridge that crossed at the western side. It's so old and crumbly, Miral noticed. Surely there will be a song written about it, one day. Eswi, close to Osrith, smiled. Elfkin had been pleased that Osrith had offered to command, but Aldhelm had told her that she could not lead, and not even fight with them. Why? Osrith asked him, affronted. If there was any army in the world she believed she truly belonged in, it was Mercia's. Because you are, in the eyes of a lot of people here, an Etheling's mother, he told her, his kindly eyes on hers. I accept you with us for your own safety. And because you have been ill, dangerously ill, Osrith, unless you wish to find a way back to Alba with Eswi. Osrith glanced at her friend. I need to take my son with me, he told Aldhelm and Eswi. Then, and I have discussed this with Eswi, he will be beside you. Then I can fight? Osrith asked, and Aldhelm reluctantly agreed. Osrith could fight with her Mercians, if not lead them, so she may find young Finan, who could be anywhere. The army passed the church where, when she had been assigned to guard Ethelflaed when she had been newly married to Aethliad, there was church, where her jealous husband had insisted Ethelflaed be subjected to the purity rite called the Bitter Waters, and she remembered the place where Utad and Gisela had stayed, an old Roman house, that had patterns and tests made by the former overlords of the country. She stayed with the mercenary camp inside London, Eswe beside her, as agreed. It was summer, it was warm, but the city smelled after dark. The fast-flowing Thames was not fast enough to displace all of the detritus and excrement out to the sea before its odor came to nostrils. And after waiting nearly a week, Aldhelm had told the commanders that Athelistan waited to the north of the city. There had already been skirmishes, but no direct attacks. No sign of an ambush or an overt attack. Neither side seemed to want to make the first move. So they were waiting still. And then Oshir suggested an alehouse, which turned into a good idea all round. It was not the ale they were used to. Osrith had boiled milk, but even that had a hint of staleness to it. I never have been naked in public, Elfkin, after several drinks and calls for more, said to the warriors. Osrith felt her face go pink, and received a sly look from Eswe. Well, once, she said, when the rest of the warriors drank. And you know why. She drank her milk then, before reaching for her head. Twice, Elfkin told her. But it was Eswe, and as we all know about Eswe, a woman's body does not entice him. Beside Elfkin, Constantine's guard raised his cup, before leaning to Osrith, as Miral stood the next round. You were going to freeze to death. You needed anyone to strip you naked and get you warm, or you would have died, he told her. And you kept repeating these phrases, he added. I have never. Osrith looked around. I have never ... met a Roman, she contributed, blandly. None of the others drank, but someone drank, at the other table. In fact, he was sitting with someone who Osrith imagined to look like a Roman. This woman was tall and slender, and had black hair to her waist. She was juggling hands with the man at the table, shifting them nervously. I have never been to a whore, Oshir continued, laughing. But Osrith wasn't playing anymore, for a man had just pushed open the alehouse door. He was as big as Steeper, the head of Alfred's household guard, tall and broad. If Osrith did not know better, it looked as if one of the statues in the palace at Winchester had come to life and was knuckling in. He slammed his fist onto the bar, and gave the customers a filthy look, as if each and every one of them had compromised his wife. I have never looked as if I have chewed granite and shitted flint, Egelfrith told them, but very quietly. In fact, all of the alehouse looked very quiet. Just a scrape of a jar from Oshir broke the silence. That's Warmond, one of Ethelm's men, Eswe told them. But he seems to be without his livery. Another man opened the alehouse door, and pushed past a table of men about to get up to get himself across to Warmond. The huge, ugly man got to his feet. Even the bartender, who was a tough-looking man himself, cringed. There is an enemy in the east, the East Anglians, the man told Warmond loudly. Do we know who they have declared for? Warmond asked, equally loudly, but then decided that he did not want to wait for an answer. Instead, he drained his cup and strode out of the alehouse, slamming the door back against the hinges as he went. So we know now, Miral told the men. You stay here and finish. I will find Aldhelm. Aldhelm had heard too, and had decided to take most of the mercenaries with him out of the city. 1 or 2 companies remained behind, and scouts could be used to find Aldhelm should a bigger attack on London come. For Ethelm had also heard the news, it seemed, and he was also riding his army out of the city and to the east, leaving the gates unguarded. For this had been a ruse, and the majority of Ethelm's men had remained hidden while the majority of Aldhelm's mercenaries had left. 88,888,888. There does not seem to be many of Ethelm's men here now, Osrith told Miral, as they rode northeast. The road took a bend to the north and here it ran almost parallel with the Lee River, a significant trading route out of East Anglia, and along which the East Anglian army were reputed to be coming. Beside her, Eswe was looking around him, glancing at warriors in the middle and far distance. She had asked Eswe whether Constantine had, as the mercenaries believed, supported Ethelm, and provided ships and men. Not to my knowledge, Eswe told her, and Osrith chose to believe him. There might have been some evidence, but she did not think Constantine would give up the large portion of land or Orleans that Ethelm would demand in exchange. And if he invited one Saxon to Alba, more would follow. As night fell, more of Ethelstan's West Saxons seemed to have evaporated, leaving most of the Mercen army facing their enemy with not one of Ethelhelm's men in sight. "It feels like a trap," Osrith told Elfkin, and her friend nodded silently. Aldhelm seemed to be coming to a similar conclusion. But then she saw one of the companies of Ethelhelm, red livery with the leaping stag. And she knew what she wanted to do. That story of Troy that young Finan had told her. "Elfkin, you know that I swore to Mercia," she told him, as they began to set up camp that afternoon. "Yes," he agreed, patiently, sensing trouble. "Don't forget your agreement with Aldhelm with Eswi," Elfkin added. "Your son is wanted, as you know you may well be as well." Osrith smiled. "You see, Ethelhelm's men have been a little careless, and left out this uniform," she told him, and showed him the livery. His face became soft, conclusive. Osrith knew that Elfkin knew she had a plan. "So I need to go. I need to find out what Ethelhelm's men are doing," she concluded. Because, whatever was going on, this was strange. Someone had to take a look around the inside of the enemy. "What?" Elfkin asked. But she was already taking her clothes off. "Osrith!" he exclaimed, as she stood in breeches and shirt. "Pass me those," Osrith asked, gesturing towards the red livery with the stag upon it. It was rumored that Constantine was allied with Ethelhelm, so she might as well make it come true. She bundled up the Mercen livery that she had just taken off and slung it over her shoulder. "I am coming with you," Elfkin said, determinedly. "Or Eswi, I will wake Eswi." You can't leave your men, they are guarding the gate," Osrith reminded him, as she saw the look of division in his eyes. He did want to go with her. He did not want to abandon his command. "And Eswi will stop me." Elfkin sighed. "I will take the men across the water at the ford," he told Osrith. "I will be behind the East Anglians, if that is who they are." And reluctantly, but determinedly, he helped Osrith dress. When he had finished, he looked across Osrith's frame. "One thing missing," he told her. And from his jerkin he pulled out her jewel. It shimmered in the evening light, its surface glowing as if it were absorbing the light itself. "Half died," Elfkin told her. "I was going to bury her with it, but I changed my mind." He glanced at it, and smiled. "I like to keep it close because it reminds me of her. And you." He pushed her hand out of the way when Osrith resisted his putting it back into her own hair. "Back where it belongs," he told her, and stepped back. "I need someone to find young Finan," Osrith said. "If I am injured, or killed, I will do it." The voice of Eswi was behind them both, and Osrith's heart rose, and she nodded, telling him what she wanted him to do if he found her son before she did. Go, as quickly as he could to Alba and take young Finan with him. Then she crept out into the night, a horse in Ethelhelm's clothing. 88,888,888. It was surprisingly easy to slip into the company of Ethelhelm's men, who were also still heading east. His men, unlike Mercia's, were made up of people who hardly knew one another, and so one more face was just one more fighting person. They marched in line with the River Lee, and with each step, Osrith imagined Elfkin bringing the Mercens behind. It must be tempting to attack, Osrith thought, but he was better trained than that, and she looked further on and saw that, at the front, was indeed this big man who had come to the alehouse and staged the dropping of the false information. And then Osrith came across a sight she did not expect. At first, she thought that it was the East Anglians, but they had with them so many children, and also men, some in chains, and some women as well. In amongst them all, Osrith saw, to her utter astonishment, were her brother's men, Finan and Osferth, Sihrik and Berg and Rorik, and with them, her son. What on earth were they doing with these people? Leading them to safety? And if so, where was the danger? She soon saw. As they settled for the night, Osrith watched as Ethelhelm's men settled further away, and it became apparent that there were spies among the red leaping stags. One would go to the edge of Utard's settlement and then report back. It was a task Osrith needed to undertake for herself, and for that to happen, She needed to gain the attention of the commander of her section. So she went to dig the latrines. 88,888,888. It worked. A hard and unpleasant job. Osrith was busy cleaning down when she chanced upon the man Warmond, who was gathering together a group of men. She followed them. It would be good to hear what it was the commander wanted from them, and they assembled in the morning light. It seemed they were going to attack the non-existent East Anglians, who were, in fact, Utid and his men. Across the river, she noticed that the mercenaries had made it across. Good, Osrith thought to herself. There were very legitimate reasons for being in East Anglia, and very legitimate reasons for a company of mercenaries to ask what was going in with a large group of people, and offer protection to them. The only difficulty would be if Utid or Finan recognized any of them, but with luck, and the breaking dawn and so many people to manage, he may not ask a lot of questions. Should we really be going this way? Osrith said to one of the guards at the back of the line, when they headed up the west bank of the Lee, in her best West Saxon accent. The man turned to her. "Where are you from?" he asked. "The latrines," Osrith told him, trying to sound nonchalant. "I was sent here by the commander." The man sniffed. "Sifwald?" he asked. Osrith nodded. The man sniffed again. "It's all right under Warmond, just don't get on his bad side." "Why's that?" Osrith asked. "Because you'll never get on any side again." The man laughed at his own weak joke. "They are the East Anglians," he told her. "So we are going the right way." And he pointed out Utid's party. 88,888,888. So, it was time to go. Get away from the Wilton men and get across to young Finan. But, as she absconded, a hand caught her collar. It was the man with whom she had talked, who had liked the sound of his own voice. "Oh dear," he mocked, as Osrith struggled, and he hit her. "You are in trouble now." More so when Warmond. He broke off, and pushed her again. "Please," begged Osrith, in mock terror. "I won't ever do it again." The man looked her up and down, then spied her Sikhs. "That is a pretty thing," he said, glancing to her hip-tagged Sikhs glittered there. "All right," he said, as if he had come to an agreement with her without Osrith even speaking. "I won't let women kill you if you give that to me." Osrith froze. If anything, tagged Sikhs was more precious to her than buay. She had to work for her sword, but the Sikhs had been handed to her by the man she had wanted to spend her life with. A rush of protectiveness came over her, shortly followed by a rush of anger. Osrith slowly withdrew it from its scabbard. "Pretty now," he told her, looking at the design of interlinked horses and hairs and curls that was common on the Pictish stones, then glanced at Osrith. "You are no West Saxon." And Osrith gave it to him. A stab in the eye, and then the other, so quick that the man did not even notice. He slumped back, away from her. Osrith ran, discarding her uniform in the body of the dead warrior. 88,888,888. And from the side of the bank opposite to Ethelm's men, and the same as Elfkin and Utid, Osrith watched. She watched the man be discovered by his comrades, and Weirmond coming over to see, and crouching to look at the damage she had done. It was reckless, she thought. All of this was reckless. But young Finan was close, and she could take him from Utid, and take him back to Alba. Cross-country if necessary. Osrith knew the routes, and the routes to avoid. And she watched as Ethelm's men staked out the line of warriors across from them, and the low ford of the river. She had to risk it. But how? The mercenaries were in pursuit of Utid, as were the West Saxons. The Sentish warriors had an alliance with Mercia, for Aethelstan, even if they were Wessex themselves. Who would move first? It turned out to be Utid. Not her brother, actually, but a group of women who wanted to wash and bathe in the Lee, and Berg. Osferth and Sihik had been selected to take them upstream. Osrith watched as they turned their back on the women, who had got into a secluded spot. Why had Utid got himself tied down with dependents? It only made them vulnerable. And vulnerable they were when Ethelm's men charged over the river, no subterfuge for them. Some went across to the women, and were faced with Berg, at first knocking them side to side, and when they tried to get up for another attempt, were stabbed by Sihik and Osferth. At the center, more West Saxons were attacking, and the defense that was being offered was being led by Uhtred himself. It was working. Some of the men who had been chained had slipped through them, and were charging at the West Saxons with wood fallen from nearby trees, while others were guarding the children, some of whom were itching to fight themselves. Osric moved to try to spy the mercenaries. No sign. They had not appeared yet, and perhaps they were waiting for some of the West Saxons to be killed before they joined. And she waited and waited, until several of the slave men had been killed, and until about half a dozen West Saxons were standing. So, with the beleaguered men in Uhtred's command, the mercenaries flew from their hiding place, and continued to fight, hacking down more of the West Saxons, while Uhtred and Finan, surprised by the speed of the attack, turned to fight the newcomers before realizing who they were. And then all fighting came to an end, because Walmond, standing in the center of the battlefield, with a sword to the neck of a man, Osric felt her blood run cold. It was young Finan. She ran, buet in hand, tagged Seeks in the other, still bloodied by her killing of the West Saxon on the other side of the bank. All the force and energy she had. She struck the man in the leg, although with his size, it was not enough to do much more than make him unsteady. But it was enough to loosen his grip. Osric struck again, her pommel of buet into the elbow joint of his right arm, which she knew would be agonizing, and as she fell from the blow he gave to her at the back of her neck, she plunged her Seeks into the hard muscle of his calf. Walmond roared, and hopped around in one movement, his blade lost, but young Finan still in his grip. Osric rolled on the ground when the man's boot came stamping towards her head, and she managed to sit up and slash at the tendon at the base of his foot. He roared again, dropping his sword,